everyone can kind of start finding their seats, I'm here today to introduce to you all Amy Peeler. Amy currently serves as Associate Professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. Her first biblical studies class, Amy knew that she was called to be a lifelong student and teacher of the Bible. She pursued this calling by attaining a BA in Biblical Languages from Oklahoma Baptist University and an MDiv and PhD in Biblical Studies from Princeton Theological Seminary. In 2013, Amy authored the book, You Are My Son, The Family of God in the Epistles to the Hebrews. In April of 2016, she was ordained and currently serves as Associate Rector at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Geneva, Illinois. From her explorations of the Bible for the church and for the academy, she loves to discover new insights into the character of God and his ways with the world. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Amy Peeler.
It's the other PowerPoint, vulnerability. If they don't have it, that's fine. Okay. It is absolutely a joy and a great honor to be with you this weekend. We have heard some powerful messages about ways to be active in our world, and my hope is that my brief comments now will facilitate your own personal development and your relationship so that you can be equipped to go out and do that great work. I had a different PowerPoint, which we'll see if they can bring it up. It's entitled Vulnerability, and if not, that's totally cool. I can roll with it. Give them just a moment. Y'all enjoying your time so far? Yeah, this is pretty amazing. Yeah. I once did a project in graduate school in which the technology did not work, and then I got a C because the technology did not work. So I'm having like moments of that happening. Well, I'm happy to get started. Well, in January of 2016, the school where I worked, Wheaton College, was under international media scrutiny and disdain. If you think back to last year, you can remember what we were going through at that time. In February of 2016, my father died suddenly from a heart attack. And over the course of the next few weeks, I preached 4 times, including in Wheaton's undergraduate chapel. In April of 2016, I was ordained, and an article about my journey in ministry appeared in the Wheaton student paper. With lows and highs, grief, anger, and inexpressible joy, I felt my life was being played out publicly before my students, members of my church, and friends near and far. The theme of my life in spring 2016, vulnerability. I have heard friends say that Brené Brown has a great phrase about vulnerability, and kind of like Caitlin admitted in our last panel, I am not a reader of Brené Brown generally, so I had to look up this quote. And this quote says, "Vulnerability is the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, and love." I'd like to focus upon the belonging aspect. How might vulnerability be related to community? How might vulnerability help us gather? In the sharing of my stories, both tenderness that cultivated connection, and also some instances of brutal honesty that built up walls, in both victories and failures, I hope I might share a clearer sense of how God calls us to wisdom in vulnerability for the edification of Christian community. So, how has vulnerability in my life worked well? Well, this is a stance I often employ in my classroom. I usually tell my students at the outset of the semester that I'm not a good poker player, which actually isn't true. But what I mean by that is that I can't feign a straight face. If I have an opinion on something, it's probably going to come out, if not in my words, then in my demeanor. So rather than trying to be that cryptic professor whose thoughts are a guessing game, I have to be honest about who I am and what I think, even and especially with controversial topics. So I found it, that necessity by virtue of my personality, that exposure, that vulnerability, has ended up creating a really healthy classroom atmosphere. When we talk about gender, well, first of all, I'm standing there teaching theology, so they pretty much have deciphered what I think about women in ministry. No big reveal there. But as I disclose how I've wrestled through that topic, the conclusions to which I've come, I have to be honest. And the same is true with LGBTQ issues, spiritual gifts, eschatology, economics, etc. When I am clear, both about my conviction and my lingering questions, students have responded in kind, and our classroom has become this wonderful little community. But last year, this openness, this vulnerability reached a new level, a level at which I was no longer comfortable, a level at which I was no longer in control, a level of vulnerability, I think, in its truest sense. It was a Friday morning, February 12th, when my husband texted me during my first class, "Call me." So right after it was over, I did. "Your mom can't get a hold of your dad." My dad traveled for work, and she hadn't heard from him in a few days. And when she checked in at his job, he hadn't come in. That didn't seem right. But I had another class to teach, and so I went. And the text of that day was 1 Corinthians, and toward the end of the hour, I was teaching on the power of Paul's dogged insistence that the Corinthians believe in a resurrection of the body. "Death, where is thy victory? O death, where is thy sting?" I knew, somewhere deep down in myself, that those words might very well take on an existential meaning for me quite soon. And as the first section of my NT Lit class ended and my second section began, my husband appeared at the door of my classroom. He called me out in the hallway to tell me the news, and surely my students heard me collapse in tears. 3 weeks from that day, I was scheduled to preach in Wheaton's chapel. The chaplain's office was really gracious. "You don't have to do it. You can reschedule." But I have lived enough life by now to know that God often works most powerfully in me when I am preparing to teach. I learn best when I have to talk to others. I wanted to do it. But that week, as I bounced around the ideas of what I thought I would speak on, nothing made sense. I scrapped it all, and late Wednesday night before Friday chapel, I wrote about my dad, his death, but also his life, and even the struggles I had had with him. I was incredibly vulnerable, talking about family dynamics around health and anger, all of which found their resolution for me powerfully in the Eucharist. I bore the current state of my soul to the Wheaton community, and through their YouTube channel, ended up bearing it to the world. That was one of the powerful tipping points of healing in my own life, not just for his sudden death, but also for some pains I had carried since childhood. And as testimonies from students and strangers have attested, God has used those words to do mighty things. Vulnerability brought healing, and vulnerability brought connection. For it is not just that people have said, "Wow, I was changed," but also, "Can I get to know you? Because I've had a similar experience." Or even more powerfully, "God used your words to encourage me to make amends with my parents," or "I have now made a special effort to reach out to my children," or "I wanted to become your friend." Little sparks of connection were birthed out of the sharing of my story. Fast forward several months to November, Tuesday, November 8th to be exact. Remember what I said about myself with that poker face thing? I'll have to cut to the chase. That Wednesday morning after the election, I was devastated. I was terrified. I was angry. And I realized there may be people in this room that didn't share those feelings, so I very much invite conversation, but I'm being honest about where I was. And I should also state, while I am a woman, I am not a person of color nor an immigrant, and so what I was feeling was probably much less than what other communities were experiencing that day. I had serious disagreements with some issues in the Democratic platform, but the Republican option to me seemed unthinkable. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't eat that morning. And not only did I have to teach my 3 classes that Wednesday, I was also up to give the homily at the weekly prayer meeting for Wheaton faculty. So what had been working well for me for a long time, especially in 2016? Vulnerability. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to share how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, how I'm praying through this, how I'm seeking to find God's word in Scripture. And in the early morning hours, I came up with a collection of comments I entitled, "Welcome to the Apocalypse." You can laugh. Which I proceeded to read in faculty prayer and in all 3 of my classes. I think this was vulnerability gone awry. It is not just that I offended some people. I actually still believe there are some clear right and wrong issues at stake here, and I'm very willing to stand by them even if I give offense. But my mistake was in process. I talked first without pausing to listen. I ignored the power inherent in the pulpit and the lectern, forgetting that from these positions, my voice was not just one among equals, but one that had the position of dominance. I didn't pause to consider that I was physically and emotionally compromised, and therefore was not in a position to decide if utter transparency was the best course of action or not. I was, all in all, impatient. And the effect was a damage to community. I needed to apologize later on to faculty colleagues and to my classes, but even after I did so, the atmosphere after that was more tense, more guarded, less conducive for the flourishing of relationships. What then have I learned? What principles, guidelines might I share for a healthy use of vulnerability? How might you, as leaders, develop the ability to maintain a posture of wise openness so that you can be an example to your team and in so doing cultivate healthy community? At one level, it seems quite simple, doesn't it? Vulnerability is to be honest, to be clear about who you are and where you are. This honesty, though, is built upon the assumption that you have something to be honest about, that you have had experiences upon which you have reflected and issues you have studied. In Christian community, vulnerability must arise, I think, out of your active life with God. Now, this is not to say that your life with God has to be perfect. Some of my most poignant conversations with students and friends come when I disclose ways in which I wrestle with God. But I can talk about those wrestlings or the victories. It seems to me that if your relationship with God is flatlined, if you aren't spending time in the Word or prayer, if you aren't attending church, then it might not be the time to be vulnerable with those whom you are leading. You probably do need to open up to a friend or mentor to help you through that season of dryness. And then later on, you can reflect upon it, probably in powerful ways with those you lead. But Christian vulnerability arises out of one's life with God. And that bears repeating. I don't mean to say that one's life with God has to be roses and sunshine, exegetical insights and exuberant prayer. It can be questions and tears and struggle. But it has to be something rather than nothing about which you can speak. If you haven't thought about your relationship with God in a month, you won't be able to be vulnerable. At least not vulnerable as a Christian. And second, when you speak honestly, Christian vulnerability should be done with a constant cultivation of humility. And I mean that in 2 respects. To be vulnerable is to be honest both about what you're sure that you know, what you're convicted about, and what you are not, where you still have questions. Convicted humility is a phrase that seems to capture this well. You might say, through my study, through my experience, this is what I know to be true. But I also realize I don't know everything. I, like everyone else, presently see through a glass dimly. Hence, you can speak with clarity about what you believe and listen with patience to those who have arrived at a different interpretation. As Tali said last night, we have things to learn from one another when we listen. But it is not just intellectual humility that is necessary. There's also a demeanor, a tone, a posture of humility that I think should pervade all open and honest Christian community-building communication. On the positive side, there must be a humbleness, a willingness to accept a compliment or affirm a gifting. And that is really hard, is it not? When someone says to you, "You did that really well," isn't it so much easier to deflect that phrase, "Oh, no, I didn't"? But it's actually much more vulnerable, much more honest, much more difficult to say, "Wow, thank you. Yeah, I was pleased with that too." And then I think immediately a habit of prayer and praise should follow. God, thank you for that gift. And then a verbal acknowledgement, because language matters. I'm really thankful for how God has worked in and through me. The same posture of humility is needed also when we're being honest about failures, because the temptation arises in one's mind when we're being vulnerable about our failures to think, aren't I so humble to admit the ways that I failed? Wow, I'm so meek and honest. Caitlin, I'm not sure where you are, but you spoke about this so well on the panel that we just did. Again, I think one possible way through that is immediately to turn it over in prayer. God, thank you for giving me the ability to be transparent and for the loving body of Christ that will support me when I do so. A wise use of God-honoring vulnerability is built upon this posture of humility, an active acknowledgement that God is God and you are not, and He is a good God, and you are a human that He has called good. And every disclosure is said and done from that position of grateful, confident humility. So you have something to speak about, and you do so with convicted humility. But when do you know that it is appropriate? An appropriate time to do so? When is the right moment to be vulnerable? The chapel message that I gave about my dad was, I think, life-giving because I had time to pray through it, think about it, share my thoughts with others, and receive confirmation before it was delivered. That post-election homily was destructive in some ways because I did none of those things. I wasn't in the state of mind to make a good decision, and I didn't wait until I was ready to do so. Now, a third story I'll share that speaks about this right moment. I don't know all the contours of the subject of gender at your institution, but in the Wheaton community, in my mind, we maintain a very delicate balance. And so I'm often quite conscious of how my presence might affect that balance. I have found our administration and students to be nothing but supportive and respectful, but I also know that many of them believe that women are limited to particular roles in the church. Hence, as an Episcopal priest, I do not waltz into class on the first day in my priest shirt and white collar. That would be being vulnerable, being honest, but not at the right time. That is why I agonized over the student paper's invitation to publish a story about my ordination on the day that it was happening. I felt then that I would be outed, that I would no longer have control over when and where I could disclose that part of my vocation. Largely because the woman who wrote the article was absolutely wonderful to work with, I ended up consenting. Because I also sensed that God was saying vulnerability is about waiting for the right time to be honest, but it's not waiting too long so that a moment for community-building transparency might pass you by. While there have been some students who have sought me out to talk more about ministry because of what they've read, it's certainly the case that the vast majority either didn't read the article or forgot that they did, so I still have a chance to disclose that part of my identity once I've built up relational trust. It's threading that needle between waiting to speak until the right moment, but not being embarrassed or not failing to speak when God has done something mighty in your life. The Apostle Paul, I think, was a pretty vulnerable guy, and Jonathan ended up speaking about this as well. His prayer life astounds me. How does he remember unceasingly in prayer all those communities he founds and visits? He is clearly immersed in the Word and in the mysteries of the Spirit. And so he can speak with great confidence about his life with God. Imitate me as I imitate Christ, he says. But I think that confidence is born out of the knowledge of who he really is. A sinner who has been redeemed by God's grace. A good creation of God that has been renewed. And he knows when it is time to be brutally honest. I think of Galatians and 2 Corinthians. And he also knows when it is time to be more circumspect. Romans is a good example. He can exercise both. My prayer for you all is that you too will abide in God and have a vibrant, complex life in him, and then find both the freedom and the patience to speak about that life with those you serve. And from that place of wise vulnerability, I think great, life-giving, God-honoring communities can grow. Thank you very much.